we want to boot from iSCSI. So probably at some point, we should configure a boot policy. By the end of this nugget, we'll be able to configure an iSCSI boot policy while keeping in mind a very important caveat. So far in these skills, we've spent a lot of time on the LAN tab and the SAN tab, but today we're going to dive into the server tab. We're going to expand policies and right-click on boot policies. From there, we will create a boot policy. Now here we're going to call this something along the lines of iSCSI boot. And we don't need an inner description. All of these configuration settings we want to leave alone. And down here we see iSCSI vNICs as an option. So we're going to expand this and say add iSCSI boot. Now this is one of the most important parts of the configuration set. We have to make sure that this name, we properly document it, because we're going to have to type it in exactly later when we create the service profiles. So we're going to call this iSCSI boot 0 and say OK. Now we have an iSCSI vNIC down here configured as we've called it as iSCSI boot 0. We do want to add a second iSCSI boot option. So we'll call this iSCSI boot 1 and say OK. Now, this allows us to have two different paths through the network, so it gives us a little bit more resilient of an iSCSI network by having two different boot points that we can attempt to connect across the network to our different storage arrays. Now, as part of any boot policy, we should expand local devices and add CD/DVD. This is because if we're going to boot up with an optical disk mounted, and in our case with UCS, it's always going to be a virtual disk, so it would be an ISO image that we attach to the service profile as it's booting up. We'd want to override the existing boots. This is pretty standard practice with any server configuration, whether it's iSCSI boot, fiber channel boot, local boot, doesn't matter. We're assuming that if we've added a CD or DVD to the service profile to boot, that's what we want to have first. So we should add this, and because we didn't think to add it earlier, we're going to have to move it up the list to the top. And with that, we've created our iSCSI boot policy. So we're going to say OK. And OK. All right. Now I do want to take a moment and showcase why the name is so important. So to do that, we're going to create a temporary service profile. And we're not going to dive deep into this, but again, it's just important that we drill into our minds how important that name is. So we're going to skip straight to networking, and we'll select expert. This is where we would normally configure all of our NICs to carry data traffic, iSCSI traffic, security, DMZ, etc. But down here we have iSCSI vNICs. These vNICs are reserved for iSCSI boot. So we're going to expand this and add an iSCSI vNIC. This name right here absolutely must match exactly what we typed in earlier, in our case iSCSI boot 0. So if we do not match this, it's going to cause problems later when we say OK and come to the server boot order and choose our iSCSI boot. We're going to find that down here, because I typed in exactly iSCSI boot 0, I have this option to set iSCSI boot parameters. This is very important that we're going to explore in another nugget. Now coming back, if I were to say, OK, I'm going to add my second one, and I just call it iSCSI 1. That is not what I called it before. It should be iSCSI boot 1, but hey, we're going to see what happens. Come over to server boot order, click on here, and you see that this option is grayed out. If you see when you're configuring your service profile that this option is grayed out, you can bet that the vNIC name, the iSCSI vNIC name, needs to be fixed. So with that, we'll cancel out of this, and we'll prepare to continue our iSCSI boot configuration. So now we know how to configure an iSCSI boot policy within UCS Manager, keeping in mind that we have to make sure that the iSCSI vNIC names that we put into the boot policy absolutely must match what we put into the service profile in the future. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.